Welcome everyone to Useful Social Media's webinar on turning social data into actionable intelligence. Over the next 15 minutes we'll be discussing how you acquire, process and utilize social data to shed light on your social performance, to inform future business decisions and to enhance customer proximity. My name's Jack Edgar and I'll be hosting today's webinar. And the webinar actually forms part of the agenda for this year's Corporate Social Media Summit Europe, which will be taking place in London on November the 18th and 19th. Sony, Barclaycard and the Wall Street Journal will be there speaking alongside over 25 other senior executives from the world's biggest and most social brands. And they'll be addressing this year's biggest topics in the social space, from social media integration and collaboration to deepening customer engagement, as well as advanced social media customer support. Now, before we start the discussion, I just want to remind you that we are recording this webinar, so everyone will receive the audio recordings as well as some findings next week. And the webinar is certainly very much interactive, so we'll be holding several polls throughout the course of the webinar. And I'd love you to get involved and vote so we can target and tailor the discussion as much to you as possible. I also urge you to type in your own questions so you can ensure that this debate, again, is targeted to your priorities and your needs. And I'll aim to get through as many of these questions as possible. We're also using the hashtag CSMEU, which you can see in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide. So please do tweet in your questions there as well as comments and any additional thoughts. As mentioned, we have three fantastic speakers who will be sharing their experiences and sharing their insight on this topic today. Firstly, Lucy Wren, who is the head of social media at Barclaycard. Tim Lyon, who is the European head of social media at Sony. And finally, Sarah Marshall, who is the social media editor for the EMEA region for the Wall Street Journal. Welcome to you all. So as mentioned, it would be great to kickstart the webinar with our first poll. Just to highlight, you can only select one answer, and I'll give you around about 15 seconds to do so. And it's a relatively broad question just to get things started. Firstly, to what extent do you feel that your company is leveraging social data effectively? So to what extent do you feel that your company is currently leveraging social data effectively? And the four options you have are, again, relatively simple. So do you feel that they are doing so very effectively, that you feel that improvement is indeed required, or in fact significant improvement required? As I say, it would be fantastic if you could vote and get involved. Give you another 5 more seconds to do so. Fantastic. Thank you very, very much. And you should have the results appearing on your screen right about now. And as you can see, there's a kind of mixed board, but certainly the majority are saying improvement is required, and the second is actually significant improvement required. So unsurprisingly, this is actually a key priority for most of you, and a key challenge at this point as well. And before we actually go into excuse me, before we actually go into how we're going to go about dealing with this and how our speakers have indeed dealt with this, I'd love to come to you first, Lucy, and actually just say, or just ask, sorry, what does leveraging social data effectively mean to you, and really what is the most motivation behind doing so?
So for me, it's about, it's as you would with any other aspect of your business and the data that business generates. Your strategy that you create for social media is created to meet the business needs, and then you set the targets to meet that strategy. So you then use that data and insight that you get to kind of improve and to meet those targets. I think the big difference in terms of social data and other areas of the business and the data that we get there is the vast amount in some respects that we get, because you can count absolutely everything, and in other respects kind of the lack of it. So kind of, there are lots of restrictions in terms of the data and the consistency of data across channels. But I think if you can do it properly, and I'm not saying that we, by any stretch of the imagination, are perfect at this. We're definitely on a journey, and I think iteration is key. But I think if you can start to show how you're delivering against business objectives, then you can kind of take social to the table, because you can show its value compared to other areas of the business.
Fantastic. So as you mentioned, there's a number of challenges involved with leveraging the wealth of social data that is available, and we certainly will come to that in a little while. But Tim, just coming over to you, really in your eyes and for your challenges at Sony, really what does leveraging social data effectively kind of mean to you, and again, what's the emphasis behind getting this right?
I think, firstly, hi Jack, and thanks. I think mostly what Lucy said is pretty bang on. I think you have to aim for where you're heading first and then use the data to help you get there. But certainly in my experience, we often have had, or I've experienced a lot of use of data retrospectively. So, you know, someone might do something, or certainly we have done campaigns or activities, collected data without really an objective for the data itself. We've had campaign objectives, obviously. And then we pull that data in and we just do this sort of post-campaign analysis and we go, okay, well, we made our targets or we didn't make our targets. But I think properly leveraging social data, or effectively leveraging social data, is more about taking a longer view and being able to work in flight and being able to optimize on the fly. Again, to your point and to Lucy's point, it isn't necessarily that easy because of the plethora of data that's available and different measures of success, different objectives of campaigns. But I think having a clear objective for the business that you're in at that point, for that activity or for that campaign, and then setting targets and using the data to make sure that you're optimizing and being able to change and potentially change what you're aiming for. If something's not working and you can see that the customer or the audience is responding differently, you know, you take that information and you pivot or change with it.
Fantastic. And again, you know, as you mentioned, Tim, it really is, you know, about setting those targets earlier and then processing and analysing your data in relation to that. Just coming over to you, Sarah. I mean, a couple of we've mentioned a couple already, but really for you, could you highlight and explain also the biggest challenge with regards to generating actionable insights? So really, rather than just, you know, some simplistic messages, but really some insight which you can go ahead and really act upon. You know, what is the biggest challenge in relation to this and actually creating that actual insight?
Yes, well, I guess the biggest challenge is probably the fact that I'm dealing with kind of social data or social or a social media plan that's kind of quite unpredictable. You know, news is annoyingly unpredictable, perhaps. So, you know, in terms of then looking at that data, you know, you're comparing apples with oranges. You're comparing two very different types of stories. But of course, that's not to say you can't learn from it. And I always think with data, it's quite obvious, but there's only point in looking at data or really focusing on it if you can learn from it. There has to be that feedback loop, and that feedback loop has to go beyond, you know, the core team, the core social media team. Other people have to kind of be able to learn from that and see. So at the Journal, kind of, we have, as a social media team, we have kind of, you know, various roles. One of them is kind of, you know, making sure the brand is out there, which is really, we have a separate commercial team doing that. But also around, we're also aiming to drive traffic to our news site and also engagement. We also do some news gathering. So there you're looking at lots of different feedback loops and lots of different learning from all those different types of things that you're seeing from the data.
Fantastic, and as you say, you know, in your position, Sarah, at the Wall Street Journal, obviously, not only do you have a wealth of data, but of course, you know, things are changing all the time as well, and you have to react to that. Just coming back to you, Lucy, I mean, you touched upon it just to begin with, but I'd love to go into a little bit more detail. You mentioned one of the biggest challenges is the wealth of data, but also perhaps the lack of it in some areas as well. Could you just elaborate on that and really how you go about kind of tackling that?
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to Sarah's point, really. It's like you can't compare like for like because everything is very different. So then it comes down to what are those stakeholder needs for the different types of content you're doing and the different types of engagement that you're doing, and just making sure that you're delivering against those and you're actually measuring the right things in order to show that. I think the other point I think I briefly touched on earlier was about the consistency across channels. So, you know, for example, the more well-established channels and the, you know, partnerships, and you get a lot more, you know, there's a lot more things to count and a lot more things to kind of show how effective something has been, versus newer emerging channels where that's really, you know, for big businesses, is a bit of a leap of faith to kind of start actually pouring resource and money into those as well. How we go about kind of being able to address that is, I guess, having a framework in place in order to show, you know, what we're trying to measure, what we're trying to achieve, and what the stakeholder needs are as well. So actually then kind of making sure that the right reporting is getting to the right people so that the insight can be actioned within those teams, which is kind of back to Sarah's point really, because you know the guys who actually create content have very, very different requirements to people who are responding to people versus somebody who's doing direct response activity within the channel. So I guess those are kind of the different areas, and the people that actually need the overall view of what's happening across all of those pieces. So it comes down to just making sure you have the right reporting in place for those different needs.
Mm. And I think, as you mentioned, and Sarah mentioned, first of all, there's the challenges with regards to actually establishing a framework for your data analysis, and also ensuring that the insight that you are generating arrives at the right place. And that's actually been highlighted a couple of times in our questions coming through from our audience on the software, and we certainly will look at that in a little bit more detail. Just before we move on to our second poll, Tim, I'd love to come to you and actually just say, really, so we've mentioned a couple of challenges associated with processing this wealth of data and actually generating actionable intelligence from it. What would you recommend is the best first step? I mean, we talked about actually setting those targets first and making sure that you are analyzing your data in relation to that. And do you have perhaps the next step after that, or something prior to that? I mean, really, what is the big first stage of getting this right?
That's a good question. I wish I had the answer. The thing that in my experience, what is important is to not get sold on data description. So you need to, and again, I think Lucy and Sarah both touched on this, knowing what you want the data to tell you, not knowing what you want the answer to be, but where are you going and what do you want the answer to, and what do you want the data to tell you. So I find that often you'll see data being either verbalized or trends described, but that's not actionable intelligence. That's data description. So I think as a first step or second step, once you have your framework, is to make sure, absolutely make sure, that what you're getting from whatever service, whether it's external or an internal analyst or anything, or even your own analysis of the data, is that you're not just describing what the trends are or what the data is telling you, but it's that next step behind that of what does this inform, what do I do from this, what do I change, who do I give this to. And the data should, if you've either got a good analyst or you have the ability to read the data for yourself, you should be able to draw that sort of story out of that. I mean, people talk about data storytellers now. It's a big sort of buzzword, but it's important. There is a story inside all of those numbers and all of those trends. And if you can sort of see through that, through all the numbers, and see what it's trying to tell you, and then from that you can respond. So I think, to answer your question, Jack, the first step or the second step is to have real clarity around what not to do with your data, as in not just look at it superficially.
And as you rightly point out, Tim, I think there is a huge difference, as you say. The way you put it is very good in the sense of there's a huge difference between data description and data analysis. And in actual fact, if you just look at your data and try and describe trends, that is not generating that intelligence and generating that insight, which will inform your future content strategy, your future wider social strategy, and your future business strategy. And I suppose a key for that, and actually making sure that you are analyzing rather than just describing, is having an established framework. And this actually brings us to our second poll. And this is, again, I'd really urge the audience to vote and really get involved. And the second question that we have looks at exactly that. And I'd love to gauge to what extent your company actually has an established framework of social data analysis. So do you have a well-established and a well-functioning framework which allows you not only to describe your data but to really analyze it in a deep and meaningful way? Or are we moving towards more of a vague framework in place, and certainly there needs to be improvement required? So just give you another 10 seconds to vote there if you could. That'd be fantastic. And just another 5 seconds. Again, we're getting some fantastic engagement on the voting, and we're getting some really great questions through on the software as well. I would urge any questions you do have, please do shoot them through now. We are gradually working our way through those. And thank you very much for that. And you should have the results coming up on your screen now. And once again, as you can see, the vast majority are in the third and fourth section, which is actually saying, you know, either a kind of vague framework, which certainly requires improvement, or in actual fact, no framework whatsoever. The majority of you listening in, actually, there is no framework whatsoever. So, I mean, again, bringing it back to you, Lucy, and me, I know you first mentioned the importance of having an established framework for data analysis. Again, what do you see as the first steps, I suppose, with so many of our audience actually having no framework whatsoever? What are the first steps in actually establishing such a framework for, I suppose, your social insight delivery?
So the first thing that we did, because earlier this year, basically, we got caught in the trap where we were just reporting for reporting's sake. And as long as everything looked kind of rosy, we were happy with it. And so at the beginning of this year, I stopped reporting altogether, continued to count, so we had that data if we needed it, but actually went back to the drawing board and kind of worked out based on, because as you can imagine, I'm sure a lot of people who are listening to this have the same I won't call it a problem, opportunity, is that because of the changing landscape with social and the things that you can do with these channels and the social media strategy changes quite a lot. So it's taken a long time for us to get to a place where we kind of have a top-level framework that allows kind of how we go about achieving that to still build up to those overall objectives. So once we kind of had that in place, it was a lot easier to go back to the drawing board and say, okay, based on this strategy, which if it's kind of set up correctly will show the business value. What are the requirements? So what are the kind of metrics that we need in order to show how we're achieving those objectives, and what are the audience needs? So who needs to see what in order to make this better or to just inform them? And then design your reporting around that. So that was kind of the first step when we went back to the drawing board earlier this year.
Fantastic, thanks, Lucy. And again, coming back to you, Sarah, and you know, again, there's a wealth of social data there, but data which is changing all the time for you, and I'm sure you have to have a framework in place to be able to deal with that. Again, what does your framework look like in with regards to the kind of social data analysis at the Wall Street Journal?
So we have one person, we have somebody called Sarah Bailey who looks at all the kind of brand and you know, how the Wall Street Journal sits in kind of, you know, perhaps a commercial opportunity and etc. And then we have our kind of editorial staff. I'm one of them, and we've got someone in Asia and then 3 or 4 people in the US at any one time. So what the framework looks like is we've kind of done a kind of amalgamation of lots of different sources of the social data. So we might take social data, for example, directly from the download on Facebook. We also use something called Social Flow for tweeting, and that's got very good reporting and downloadable statistics. And then what we did is, you may also be familiar with something that I've certainly found very useful recently called BuzzSumo, BUZZSUMO. And you can do things like search what is our most social story of the day, for example, or you can take a term and go something like, you know, if you're doing a story on cycling, you can kind of look at that term and see who the influencers are in that community. So what we've done is kind of taken data from a range of sources, both at real time and then also kind of longer view in terms of downloads. And you're probably familiar with VLOOKUPs and kind of combining spreadsheets. So that's been all done at the back end by a colleague of mine, and then we kind of get you know, the daily emails and things like that, just to really help provide, as I said before, those feedback loops. What can you learn from it? And what I also think is important is looking not only at the vanity metrics of kind of, oh, this story did really well, you know, of course, you know, for the Wall Street Journal, a story comparing the Apple's new iPhone is going to do really well on Facebook, we know that, but actually what didn't do well, you know, always look at kind of what surprised you in terms of it just didn't get the reach, and what can you learn. I think you learn more from that than you do from your successes.
Certainly, and in actual fact, moving actually slightly beyond rather than just the framework and actually going into a little bit more detail. Coming to you, Tim, one of the questions asked coming through on the webinar software is actually in fact how often does your social data have to be analysed, or how often do you analyse that to kind of reach optimal resource insight, and how do you balance that?
Again, it's a good question. In an ideal world, you'd have what some brands definitely do have, and I think these people and these brands are doing it right, where they have their command centres. When I know a lot of the listening platforms like to try to sell command centres. I'm sure they're quite lucrative, but they make a lot of sense. And if you can have that, if you can be virtually doing it in real time, then of course that's the silver bullet. But it's pretty unrealistic for most brands, particularly since, and I'm pretty sure Lucy and Sarah would agree with me on this as well as you, perhaps Jack and everyone, is that it's still early days in terms of justifying large investments in social and social data specifically, particularly as we've touched on a few times, considering that there isn't really any agreed key metrics that are sort of industry standard like we have with some of the other channels like web and web analytics and email and so on. But I think in terms of regularity, we look at it in a couple of ways. We get a weekly dashboard that arrives early in the week, usually on a Tuesday for the week that preceded. That I look at that immediately, and that's just the numbers when I get that on a Tuesday evening. But then on this sort of ensuing 48 hours, our two agencies that do our community management and content creation across Europe start to work up that with one of my team members who is responsible for performance management, and Adnan, who sits in Vienna, will work on developing out the insight from that data. So on a Thursday, usually by Thursday afternoon, we've got that dashboard with some sort of qualitative insight from it that we can look at and we can share back out with our market. So it forms two things. It's effectively a report for the preceding week, but the process of analysing it with the agencies and with my team informs the content planning for the following week. So we've kind of got this 1 week lag, which is not ideal, but the way we do our content, it seems to be effective. Then we get monthly dashboards, and these are drawn, as Sarah said, from all sorts of sources. We've got Radian 6, we've got Social Bakers, we draw directly from Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, and cobble it all together into an Excel dashboard. But one of the key things that we get in terms of reactive data analysis, and it might be a bit of a stretch to call it data, but I think it's an important part in performance management, is that our community managers and moderation team are responsible for their own markets. We split out by markets. We've got someone responsible for Germany, someone for France, etc. And they are looking at anecdotal performance on a day-to-day basis and feeding that into not only how they react on page or on platform, but also that then goes into the dashboard cycle. So we've got anecdotal and qualitative feedback going into the numbers. But again, to come back to you, more directly answer your question, Jack, I think ideally, if you can do it real time, great. But so long as you have time to react, so we do our editorial planning on a 2-month cycle. It's not entirely rigid, so we can take the data and it can inform us, but we do look back at the trends over the previous 2 months, and that informs the planning for the next period. So it kind of depends on how you're publishing and what business you're in and how often you're publishing, I think.
As you rightly mentioned, if you do have the capability to be able to react in real time, then that's fantastic. But obviously, I suppose all of us are on this journey, and there's different stages that people are at, and it's about, as you say, really putting the right mindset and framework in the way in which you go about you looking at your data. I suppose that's the most important thing for all companies in the first instance. And before we move away from this question of actually the framework and how you actually really go about analysing data on a day-to-day basis, I'd just like to come to you quickly, Lucy. And we've actually had a question coming through from Fiona again on the webinar software, and she just asked, apart from the analytics and tracking of things like likes and shared stories and comments, how else is your data being collected on a day-to-day basis?
I guess it kind of comes back to Tim's point. There is this whole, the guys who are actually doing the responding and putting the content out there, they get to see the data every single day, but not the insight. And then it's actually kind of what those kind of weekly, monthly, quarterly, yearly levels, you can start to actually kind of see the trends. For us, I guess, it varies by department, so each area has obviously the key objectives it is trying to achieve, but in order to analyze our content and how successful, kind of the key metrics we use to understand how successful that has been, and therefore kind of benchmark things and understand, like Sarah said, kind of what hasn't gone that well, and therefore what can we learn from it, and what has gone well and what can we learn from that. We use a kind of blended measure of reach, organic reach, engagement rate, and sentiment, which is actually manually marked by our web relations team, believe it or not, which kind of gives us a bit of an indicator in terms of how something has performed. And then we can kind of go in and have a look at why and start to pull out the insight from that. Does that answer the question, or is there anything else you want to do?
No, I think so. And again, it comes back to the wider question. I think of the first instance, you have to be looking at really what do you want your social data to tell you. You have to have that target and that mindset to begin with. Was something that's coming through the time and time again on the question board and also on Twitter is this relationship between social data analytics and also traditional analytics. And just coming back to you, Sarah, obviously there is a key challenge with with regards to aligning social data analysis with the kind of the existing and traditional analytics that people perhaps are more used to. How have you gone about tackling this and amalgamating this information and processing this?
So I think there's the two ways. You kind of look at the real-time stuff, and being a news publisher, we use something called Chartbeat, which kind of gives you your stats of stories in real time, and you can see which stories are kind of going up and finding more traffic and which stories are going down. And on that, for example, you can see quite a lot of the social metrics. So you can very quickly respond and think, okay, well, I put that, today, this morning when I was on our main account, I was thinking, okay, I put out the big Pistorius news that it was ruled that he couldn't be found guilty of murder. So you put out that as one headline, and then you put out another headline saying, okay, so now he's going to either be acquitted or he's going to be found guilty on the lesser charge of manslaughter. So you kind of can look at that, and you do the very much real-time response, and that's very rewarding in a way. And then I guess probably once a week, I really dive in and say, okay, so how much traffic, for example, did we get from Facebook this week? How much traffic did we get from Twitter? And then you kind of, over time, we've really kind of, adapted and changed how we approach things, because, initially, all journalists love Twitter, and you become very obsessed with pushing stuff out in real time. But actually, even an organization, a news site like the Wall Street Journal, which perhaps isn't necessarily always thought of as a real kind of Facebook audience, because then actually Facebook is an incredibly important part of not only to drive traffic, but creating community and getting to new readers, etc. So you really do kind of change your approaches as you look at that top level weekly data.
And ultimately, I'd love to kind of push this question over to you as well, Lucy. So really, with regard to social data analysis, how do you kind of deal with this balance between new types of data and the wealth of social data that is available, and also traditional analytics? How do you bring those together? How do you manage the relationship between the two? Again, with the aim of generating actionable insight from the both of them.
I think for me it's about actually being able to compare like for like, which obviously isn't that easy. In some respects you can do that. So for our DR activity, for example, it's quite easy to say, well, the CPA for this channel was this and the CPA from social was this, and therefore is that working well or not? But for the softer side, I think that's kind of still in progress for us. I think one of the quick wins that you can do is start trying to put social media data and the words that we use as a social community into business language. So what is it that your business is used to hearing? So that's quite a big win, because it kind of takes people a little bit more on that journey with you, and people kind of start to understand how that kind of correlates in some way to something else that's happening somewhere else. However, correlation isn't all that great compared to if you can actually kind of start putting causation alongside that and kind of saying, actually, this is what social exactly drove, which, as I've just touched on, you can do with kind of the likes of DR, customer service, for example, but kind of in terms of your content and measuring the success of your content, unless you start, and this is something we've got in plan for the end of this year, which is looking slightly ambitious at the moment, but to actually start looking at attribution modeling. So like Sarah said, where did the traffic come from, for example, and you have a look at all the activity that's happening and start then to kind of attribute by channel. You look at, you know, this behavior change happened, what was going on at that time, and therefore kind of how do you then start assigning causation to those social channels. So that in my head is kind of where we're trying to get to, but I think there is this kind of short-term win that people can do quite quickly in terms of the business language, and then the second thing is a much longer term, because it relies on you having what you're trying to achieve in social spaces aligned and how you can report on that, as well as having kind of all of your other activity kind of in order as well, which you know, is kind of easier said than done with the way that things change so often.
And I think as you mentioned earlier, Lucy, and also, again, this is a question which has come up time and time again, the engagement we're getting is fantastic, and I'd love to kind of hit this on the nail head, hit this on the on the head now, is actually, you know, obviously there's challenges with regards to actually turning social data into actionable intelligence, but just as challenging, some might argue, is actually ensuring that this insight then arrives at the right place in the right department to maximize its impact. And just coming to you, Tim, I mean, a company as big as Sony, how do you go about distributing this insight, generating from your social data, to make sure that it is used in the most effective way, and I suppose it arrives at the right door?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a challenge, without a doubt. We rely heavily on a sort of with the day-to-day, with those weekly dashboards that I mentioned a little earlier, we rely quite heavily on a bottom-up approach. And I think this entirely depends on how your business is structured, but certainly for Sony at the moment, as I mentioned before, the business is generally structured into local markets. So the online responsible in each market will receive the dashboard and the insight from us when it's completed at the end of the week, but they'll have also had earlier in the week a one-on-one conversation with their community management team for their markets. So they've discussed the previous week's performance, what content went out, what worked, what didn't. Then they combine that knowledge with the dashboard, and then I put the onus on them to report up in their market to their line managers and above, because for Sony at least, and in Europe, we're still very much in an education phase that touches on the previous topic of other data from other channels. We have strongly well-established reporting mechanisms for email and web analytics and sales, and all the various other data sources are delivered, and they've been delivered in, people are used to them, if I can say that. So they know what they're getting when they're getting it, and they know how to read it. So again, to Lucy's point previously, someone gets a dashboard that says that we've done really well this week. We've got less than one. We've got 0.4% engagement, or 0.04%. You've got these minute numbers which we know aren't bad, but to other areas of the business, they go, well, hang on a minute, how come you're all celebrating minute figures? So you have to rely on people sharing that information face to face. So to come back to answer the question, I rely on the local teams to feed that information up, and then from a central level, I feed my information up from my position to my line manager, director, and to the senior team in Europe weekly, and have myself very open to questions. We don't get a lot, and it's something that I'm continually pushing for, and I send a monthly email that sort of gives everyone a nudge again and says, let me know if you have questions, but it's a difficult thing to do unless, before we started the webinar, we were discussing our recent IFA, the big electronics fair in Germany. That's a big deal, and one of the key KPIs set by Tokyo was share of voice. So suddenly everybody's talking about share of voice, and everybody across the business is an expert in online buzz and share of voice, and they're getting these daily reports which show us versus competitors, and it's great because it opens the conversation. So I think, I know I'm not answering the question directly, but certainly for me, the distribution of the data goes hand in hand with education. So what you're trying to do is build people's appetite, and then they'll come looking for it.
Certainly, and as you say, and actually generating a culture which, again, is open to and embraces social media as a whole, from the grassroots all the way up to the highest level. And again, one of the questions which is coming through kind of thick and fast, both on Twitter and also through the software, is the relationship between social data analytics and specifically your social performance insights, so social media ROI. And this brings us nicely to our third and final poll. And again, just to gauge from those listening in the extent to which you currently feel that social data analytics are giving you a clear and a transparent picture of your social performance, as well as an in-depth understanding of your customer. We'd love to see to what extent you are currently doing so. So, as you can see, the question is up there up on your screens now, and you have four options. So firstly, a very clear picture of both, in actual fact. A good clear picture of perhaps one, so your social media performance more widely, but not necessarily an in-depth understanding of your customer or of your one particular audience segment. And then the final two, you require more clarity in that, or in actual fact, significant improvement on that. Again, I'll just allow another 5 to 10 seconds just to collect all the votes on that. But as I say, please, I'm trying my best to rattle through all the questions that we're getting through, and I hope I'm covering the vast majority of them. But please do keep sending them through. We're racing through them thick and fast. Thank you very much for all the voting. We've closed that now. And as you can see, once again, the vast majority of you sit in the last two categories. So it is about requiring more clarity on both sides, both in relation to your social performance and also a deeper customer understanding. And just to come back to you, Lucy, I mean, I'd love to really kind of inquire. I know you're going into a lot more detail in this, actually, at the Corporate Social Media Summit Europe in November, but I'd love to kind of just get a little bit of insight, really, how you're currently processing the data to generate a clear performance insight. Are you zoning in on specific KPIs and specifics that matter to you? How are you generating and accurately tracking the success of a particular campaign and your performance as a whole?
So I think this all comes back to kind of the theme of this whole conversation. What is it that it's trying to achieve? So for direct response, it could be, so we have a target around ticket sales. So the number of ticket sales that we generate through our music and entertainment program, we can, kind of pull that information quite easily and then compare that to other channels. So then that gives us kind of a voice in that conversation in terms of how much investment should go into that channel. I say that quite easily. It wasn't an easy process, isn't an easy process to set up, just to so I don't upset anybody, but now we're able to kind of compare that. But I think on the content piece, it's much, much harder. But as I've kind of talked about, I use this blend of sentiment, reach, and engagement to kind of indicate overall success in terms of how a campaign has performed, so that I can compare like for like. Within each campaign will have its own targets in terms of what it's trying to achieve, and which of it may be that one of those measures is more important, or it may be more about driving traffic to the site or getting people to sign up to something. And each of those will then get, each of the individual campaigns will then get kind of rated based on that. I think then once you've kind of got those data points set up, and you can kind of say this looks like it's performed really well, or this looks like it hasn't performed really well, you go into that, and that's when you pull out the insight, and it's the insight on which you can actually, that's what's actionable, not the data.
And I'd love to, on a differing side, for you, Sarah. I mean, again, how are you using your social data to generate a kind of clear picture of your social performance more widely? And again, if you have an example of perhaps analyzing that data in relation to a specific campaign, again, how did you really generate a very transparent picture of what the success of that was?
So I'm perhaps in a slightly different position than kind of Lucy and Tim in the fact that we're kind of, we're concentrating on kind of pushing news out and very much kind of, against not exactly against the clock, but trying to get things out as quickly as possible, and that's our focus rather than necessarily kind of trying to drive, ticket sales or whatever, as Lucy gave the example of. So, we perhaps take always a more kind of short-term approach with from the news side of things. And like I said, we also have somebody looking at the brand who's based in the US who kind of does the bigger picture stuff that's more similar to the way Lucy and Tim are kind of focused. But we very much are kind of compare and contrast. And for example, yesterday I was kind of doing on the main accounts, on the main Wall Street Journal accounts, following the big Apple announcements, and you very quickly learn that people are most interested in news about the iPhone much more so than the watch. So just very simply and actually people are much more interested in seeing pictures or charts or information broken down in very simple ways than actually reading about it. So you kind of quickly respond to that, and I guess those things are obvious, and you're probably kind of very familiar with the what's popular, etc. But that's kind of something that you respond to in real time, and we've got a lot of content that's being produced at the journal, so you can really give people what they want in a sense on social media.
And in actual fact, Sarah, actually using your social data to inform that content strategy, that's something which I'm going to come to in a couple of minutes. You had a couple of questions come through on that. But before we do that, I just want to quickly come back to you, Tim, and it's linked to, as you mentioned, actually having a company culture which embraces social media. And I suppose the insight that can be gained from effective social data analytics, it can give a depth of insight that really should inform your individual social campaigns, your social strategy, but also your wider business strategy as a whole. And do you think that this level of insight and this depth of insight, again, if you're able to generate that and process that in the right way, will actually help social media teams, get a seat at the table from the very off and during the major decision-making processes?
Yes and no. I mean, I think it's unrealistic. So I can only speak from my experience. But in an organisation as large and as traditional as Sony, and again, to Sarah's point just a moment ago, where we're in the business of selling products, that's our end goal, is for someone to buy a television. And so we sit, I think Lucy was speaking a moment ago about attribution, and that's something that we're sort of looking at as well. What's our role in the customer journey? And once we can prove that value, and then we come back to the ROI question, and it becomes quite a messy knot, because suddenly you've got to say, okay, so we're investing X in community management and content creation and then paid social and so on and so forth, and it's delivering what exactly? We certainly, we've tried, and we are unable yet to draw a line between what we do on social and how many sets of headphones or televisions or whatever you like are sold in at John Lewis or somewhere else, at Media Saturn in Berlin or anywhere like that. So it's a tricky game in terms of things, because until you can prove that, because that's the bottom line, you're not going to really get a seat at the big table. Having said that, what we can learn about our customers' voice and what they want from the brand is a whole different sort of kettle of fish, and it's something that we're not nailing at the moment. It's certainly going to be a big focus for next year for us. We're seeing more and more and more, as I'm sure everybody is, on social, particularly as a brand, people do want to tell us usually what we're doing wrong or what they don't like, very occasionally what they do. But if you can get some skin in that game, then I think you can change that conversation and you can learn a great deal from your customers. If you can learn that from your customers, and if you use your social data to give evidence to your senior team that your your audience and your customers are the same people, and I think that's an important distinction as well. Just to go slightly off track for a quick minute, we know that certainly for Facebook, due to a legacy of fragmented acquisition, we have quite a young male-skewed audience on Facebook, which is great, but they're not exactly aligned with our target market for some of our higher-end products. Now that's fine, we can build up aspiration and we can build up advocacy and we can build up sort of the fanboy element, but that's not going to help us draw a line between sales. And so again, I've strayed a bit as usual, Jack, but to come back to your question, until you can prove real attribution with your data, I don't think in the business that I'm in anyway, you're going to influence a great deal of business decisions. And again, if you're going to try to prove to change brand perspective or the way the brand behaves because you're getting a lot more brand feedback, that's a bigger question again, because that's not sort of tactical or strategic, that's big brand stuff, and that should be a goal, but it's not an easy one to achieve.
Certainly. And I'm aware of the time, and I know that we're gradually approaching the end of the webinar. And before we do that, I just really want to kind of tackle some of the questions coming through, and a lot of them are actually looking at specific examples. I'd love to hear some specific examples. So just coming to you, Lucy, really, could you share any examples of how you have firstly effectively analysed and processed your social data, and then use this intelligence to positively influence your decision making? For example, perhaps in relation to a content campaign or your wider content strategy. Do you have any examples of that process? This is what we've been told, and this is how we adapted or changed our strategy to kind of take this into account.
I think, well, from a how have we kind of changed within social based on what people have said? There's definitely been more of an emphasis on humanization, which is such a robot word for something that's meant to be the complete opposite. But I think social gives us this massive opportunity to actually have one-on-one interaction with people in an open and transparent way that no other channel really does for us. And I think it's actually kind of pushed us to be a bit more open in the way that the guys who actually do all the responding, the community management, talk to people. Because as you can imagine, for a regulated industry, trying to, and we started off, we were one of the first in the UK, I think, in terms of financial services to actually have branded presences on the big social sites. And as you can imagine, kind of doing that and getting our legal and compliance bods to sign up to that was, it's quite a rigorous process. And at first, our customer service guys did sound a little bit robotic, and people it wasn't sincere, and it was completely inappropriate for the environment. So I think we've made a concerted effort to kind of make it the opposite of that, and actually let the guys kind of have more of a conversation rather than a hello, yes, I will help you, thanks very much, goodbye type response. So that's been one big thing actually within our social environments that's changed as a result of kind of what we've seen come through, and that has resulted in the guys getting extremely positive feedback. They honestly are absolutely phenomenal. Like I would never ever advocate another service channel for us, although I probably shouldn't be doing that over this. But then also, I guess on the flip side of that, we do. Those guys are the guys that kind of get. They hear when something's broken. That they're the ones that hear about it first, and then that kind of goes on and gets prioritised and gets fixed quicker as a result. We get so much insight from the campaigns in terms of what people want and what they don't, what they do and don't want to see within our social channels, what they do and don't want to see as part of our service offering, for example, which has impacted business decisions.
As you rightly mentioned, Lisa, you can use that and actually to adapt your tone and excuse me, and actually balance it. What is a personal approach, but at the same time not going off your wider brand narrative, and ensuring that that you have that consistency there at the same time. And coming through to you, Sarah, actually, Justin, on the questions, asked, a specific question directly to you. Really, how do you direct and adapt the type of content you're putting out based on the social data that you are collecting?
Well, I think we also always have to be driven by the kind of news agenda and what we're putting on site, etc. We don't, just because people are interested in lots of news about the iPhone 6 doesn't mean that we should, put that out at the, at the loss of any kind of big news on Ukraine or big news coming from, a particular kind of story that we're covering. So, of course, we are very much editorially led from that point of view, and I think anybody going to our Facebook page or Twitter account should also see, something of what the full range of the journal content is. So again, you're not kind of feeding people. You're giving people what they want, but you're not necessarily doing that to the detriment of other things, and I think people appreciate that overall. So I think that's kind of one kind of way that we do that. But I think coming on to Tim's point about how do you actually kind of prove your worth to those people in board meetings, etc. And I think the kind of key thing sometimes is you just have to accept sometimes that some parts of social are unmeasurable. When I'm sure my bosses would love it if I could say, yes, I'm driving subscriptions to the Wall Street Journal by putting out news items, etc. But realistically, I would always say to them, look, social is the first introduction to the Wall Street Journal, the first introduction to the brand, and then they become regular readers, and down the line they start to pay for exclusive content, etc., etc. So I think actually, even though perhaps the others would disagree with me, I think actually some of this is actually unmeasurable, and you just have to go with either your editorial instinct or your kind of just accept that people might end up being a subscriber as a result, or in Tim's case, going into a shop in Berlin and buying a product. But how you prove that, unfortunately, if you're expecting to listen and come up with all the answers, then I actually don't think they exist.
As you rightly point out, there's an element of your heart as well as your head involved in all of this. And I think this actually brings us to our final question. We're actually going to, before we end the webinar, we're just going to look a little bit to the future. And I'm just coming back to you, Tim. Really, do you see any big changes on the horizon with regards to social data analytics and the way in which actionable customer insight and actionable performance insight, etc., is generated and is utilized?
Well, no, I don't. At the moment, I can't see anything sort of radical on the horizon myself. I could be wrong. I'm often wrong. One of the things I would like to see some sort of, and this is a bit of a pipe dream, some sort of universal agreement of what success looks like on social, and this is specifically in terms of social metrics, because we've said a few times, I think, all of us have said this and agree that social metrics and business metrics aren't necessarily the same thing, and you need to sort of translate one into the other. But for the social specialists, for the people in your business that are the specialists, I think it would be great if I could say to you, Jack, or to Sarah and Lucy, we're achieving X as a key sort of success metric, and everybody go, that's great. And not, okay, so we all say engagement, we all know about a little bit of reach and this and that, but the formula behind how that's calculated changes. I mean, it's changed. In my tenure at Sony, we've changed how we measure engagement at least 3 times as the platforms have evolved, as we've learned more about the platforms. So this is not something I'm necessarily sort of foreseeing, but it's something that I would like to see somebody to hand down a verdict and say this is how engagement on Facebook is measured, industry standard. This is how it's measured on Twitter, industry standard, etc., etc. Probably not going to happen, but I think some sort of universal agreement of the, and I guess actually, I've come to this just now while thinking about this, as I was to firmly place and have accepted where social is in the customer journey, no matter whether it's introduction to the brand that then builds that sort of lifetime value, or ticket sales, or people taking up a service from Barclays or something like Lucy mentioned, or for us, they already do because the brand, I think, is something that's on the horizon. Then I think that will give us a lot more to sort of deal with.
Unfortunately, Tim, I was just about to say there was a little bit of interruption there. We couldn't quite hear what you caught at the end there, but certainly I think we all share the the desire for some kind of universal agreement on really what is social media ROI and how do we look at that? How do we assess that? And I'm just to end up, Lucy, I'd love to come to you finally and actually say, the same question. I mean, do you see any big changes on the horizon with regards to social data analytics, both in terms of the horizon in general, but also in terms of your specific aims and targets at Barclaycard?
I think it's kind of not really a big something's going to happen, but we have seen in the last 3-4 years. It's just getting better and better all the time. I think actually one of the big changes is the fact that you kind of used to have this mythical social media analyst person who would come in and transform everything, and actually what I've found over time is actually all it takes is a really good analyst who has who can kind of get that great understanding of the tools and the sources and the ways of interpreting that data, and that's what's going to make the big difference, is actually kind of getting those people with the minds and with the skill sets concentrating on this, and actually being able to kind of to take what we need from all of the data that we get and turn that into insight. Because I think that's something that we've kind of struggled with a lot over time. So yeah, I think once we kind of have that, it's less of a case of people who are actually dealing with social media and content and the kind of strategic part, and trying to, which is kind of what I do, so trying to do the reporting stuff as well, just because there isn't that wealth of understanding elsewhere. And actually you'll get people with the right skill sets who are the ones who are telling you exactly how you should be doing this. And I think that is when we'll kind of have a step change.
Lucy, thank you very much. Again, another very insightful answer, and really what has been nice about today's discussion is both, although you have agreed on many points, there has been differing perspectives, both from speakers, but also our audience through Twitter and typing in through the webinar software as well. Unfortunately, this is now the time for the end of the webinar. We undoubtedly have gone over a little bit of time. Apologies for this, and apologies if I wasn't able to get round to your question. As I say, we had some fantastic engagement and interaction with the discussion, so thank you again for that. Of course, I'd like to say a huge thank you to our speakers for today, to Lucy, to Tim, and to Sarah for their great insight and their great contributions. As I say, I've thoroughly enjoyed the discussion. It's been hugely valuable, so thank you again for that. And before everyone heads off, I just want to give another heads up that we will be sending out the recordings of this webinar next week, so there's no need to worry if you missed any part of today's discussion. What's more, if you'd like to hear more from Lucy, Tim, and Sarah, they will actually be speaking alongside another 25 other leading executives in the social space at the 5th Annual Corporate Social Media Summit Europe in London on the 18th and 19th of November. As you can see, all the relevant links are at the bottom of the slide, and it would be fantastic to check out the full speaker lineup and the outline of all the sessions, and also see again what Lucy, Tim, and Sarah will be talking on. Each of them are talking on 3 separate panels, and we'd love to hear your feedback and to see if the critical topics that we've identified do indeed resonate with you as well. So please do take a look at that and let me know. That would be fantastic. A final thank you again to our speakers, and once again thank you to you for joining us. And I hope you can join us again in the future. Have a great day. Bye-bye.